Now, while we've got this triune brain picture here, I would like to talk a bit about it. This is from Freedom Expanded, a printout of Freedom Expanded, which I often refer to if you want to read more about a certain subject and go to Freedom Expanded. And I think in paragraph 245 of Freedom, I did make a reference to what I'm now going to talk about. And this is a really interesting idea that I want to talk about. Tell you this very interesting story. In the 1950s, the American neurologist Paul MacLean developed his theory of the triune or three-part brain. Now, he wrote that these three evolutionary formations might be imagined as three interconnected biological computers, with each having its own special intelligence, its own subjectivity, its own sense of time and space. So basically, MacLean has recognised that these parts of our brain are independent. They sort of act independent of each other. So up to a point, he has recognised the disconnection between the limbic system, our instinctive self or soul, and the neocortex, our conscious mind, that I'm saying caused the human condition. And I know people have said to me that MacLean has already put forward my explanation of the human condition, but he hasn't really. As I'll now explain, but what he does say is very helpful. So this is this bit that I wanted to talk about. That's quite interesting and revealing. What happened is that this is from his book. What happened is that the description of what happened. MacLean became fascinated with the limbic storms. That's the storms from our limbic part of our brain, from our soul, our instinctive self, suffered by patients with temporal lobe epilepsy. So they had a breakdown in their brain. During seizures, he recalls, they'd have this eureka feelings of revelation that this is the truth. He wrote that all on its own, without the reality check of the neocortex, the association cortex, the limbic system seems to produce sensations of déjà vu, sudden memories, waking dreams, messages from God, even religious conversions. Feelings of eternal harmony, immense joy, paradisical happiness, what it was like to be in heaven, feelings of enhanced awareness or the feeling of clairvoyance, of having clear, bright thoughts that seem as if this is what the world is all about. This is the absolute truth. So what is incredible is I talked to you I've talked about it in the first webinar about the shattered defense, where people their upset gets so great that their alienation gets broken down and bits of truth bubble through that our defenses, our denials, but so what you've got here is something even better than that. So people with brain seizures get this totally clean access to our all loving and sort of all sensitive, instinctive soul, and they have all this. So all those responses that he documented, sudden memories, waking dreams, messages from God, of God as the integrative ideal state, as I mentioned last webinar, even religious feelings of eternal harmony, this cooperative state we once lived in, immense joy, paradisical happiness, what it's like to be in heaven, feelings of enchanted awareness, or the feeling of clairvoyance, clear, bright thoughts. There's all perfect descriptions of what it was like before the conscious mind emerged and became at odds with our instinctive self, our instinctive self or limbic brain, and shut it down or repressed it, which I'll talk a bit more about shortly. But so these people that he was watching revealed this magic potential that we've killed off, this radiant part of ourself, because of its unjust condemnation of our our conscious mind, which is searching for understanding. So that was a tragic price to pay. We lost all those amazing capacities, abilities. Now, what is very significant in terms of mechanistic science, what MacLean did next in his thinking is that what he did was to complain that, this is a quote, the limbic system has a loose grip on reality. He said, what bugs me most about the limbic brain, this is our instinctive soul, that it provides us with the feelings of what is real, true, and important. So we've once lived in this cooperative, loving, harmonious, integrative state, which is very powerful, and it has this expectation of us to behave in this loving, cooperative way. So he says, what disturbs me? Because this inarticulate brain sits in like a jury and tells the neocortex, you can't believe this. It's not a good idea. Basically, it criticizes us. Adding, don't fall for the soul trap of the middle brain. You shouldn't leave your higher brain out of value judgment process. So basically, MacLean's observations of people with temporal lobe epilepsy, he recognised that we have an extremely idealistic, all-loving, pre-conscious limbic part of our brain. But he tried to cope with that by dismissing it, saying it is a loose grip on reality and warned us not to fall for the soul trap of the middle brain. Basically, that it's totally unrealistic part of ourselves and we should just ignore it. So what happened is he sort of stumbled onto the truth of our loving soul and then ran away from it as fast as he could from its sort of confronting implications by just saying, just ignore it, it's unrealistic. He didn't stay with the problem and figure out why this different limbic brain was unrealistic. And of course, beyond that, why the limbic brain was so loving, and how did we get such a moral, loving, instinctive conscious in the first place? No, he recognised these parts of our brain were acting independently of each other, which was a very insightful realisation. So he got close to the truth, but then he sort of veered away from it. So he's watching these people suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, and he's discovering they have these amazing capacities, and then the implication, which is just don't deal with it. It's just unrealistic, and it is. The world has become massively angry, egocentric, and alienated. So this all-loving soul within us is totally bewildered and offended by this, which is why this conflict between these two selves emerged while we repress the soul. But he's just not going to go. He just says, just forget it. He's not going to wrestle with it. I mean, what's so important is that in my case, I didn't stumble on the truth of our moral soul. Rather, I could always see it being sort of unresigned and innocent and sound and secure enough to recognise and look at and think about the situation of these two selves within us, the instinctive moral part of ourselves and our newer conscious self. And then from there, work out why there was this conflict between the two. So that's the difference. I was able to engage with the issue of the human condition, whereas MacLean sort of accidentally happened upon it and then wasn't prepared to engage with it, just to dismiss it. This, as I said, so yes, people have said my explanation of the human condition is not original, but that Paul MacLean and others have already explained it, but they haven't. I mean, Moses' 3,500-year-old story of the Garden of Eden, as I mentioned in the first webinar, described the elements involved in producing the human condition, which was that the garden, this Garden of Eden of original innocent state, and then we took the fruit from the tree of knowledge, became conscious, recognised those conflicting elements, but he didn't. Moses could certainly have was sound enough to sort of to wrestle with that and explain it, had there been science that explained the difference, the nature of these two learning systems, the gene-based and nerve-based learning systems, as I explained in the first webinar. So MacLean had the benefit of science, unlike Moses, but he wasn't sound and secure enough to confront the human condition and solve it. as I mentioned, there's a reference in paragraph 245 of freedom, and also there is in freedom expanded here in the section titled "The History of the Search for Understanding of the Human Condition," about thinkers like Paul MacLean who went close to the explanation of the human condition, then fearfully veered away from it and didn't get to the bottom of it. So I might just describe a few more of such thinkers that veered away, that got close and then veered away. These are all evidence of just how fearful and difficult the human condition has been to engage with and solve. I mean, in the 1930s, philosopher George Gurdjieff recognised the three separate parts of the brain, one for the spirit, which is the intellect, one for the soul, the emotional, instinctive self, and one for the body, the primitive foundation part of our brain. But he didn't look into the nature of the differences in those effects. In his 1949 book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, psychologist Eric Newman did recognise there was a conflict between our old and new brain, writing that whereas originally the opposites could function side by side without undue strain and without excluding one another, now with the development and elaboration of the opposites between conscious and unconscious, instinct and intellect, they fly apart. Ego and consciousness identify themselves in principle one side and leave the other in the unconscious, either preventing it from coming up at all, i.e. consciously suppressing or repressing it. Only deep psychological analysis can then discover the unconscious counterposition. So he's recognised that there was a conflict and they flew apart, and the conscious self repressed this unconscious instinctive part of ourselves. The ego and conscious identify themselves in principle one side, which is and leave the other, which is our unconscious limbic part of our brain, repressed. But the question is screaming to be addressed and asked is why exactly does the conscious mind repress the soul? Because that's what my book explains. So Newman and others like him, such as Carl Jung, Ken Wilber, and Carl Sagan, recognise the involvement of the elements of instinct and intellect in our unique conscious situation, but they didn't get to the bottom of the problem, explain why a conflict occurred between the two parts of our brain. Evidence that these other thinkers were also afraid of the human condition is that they, like MacLean, dismissed the significance of our moral soul. Now, while MacLean dismissed it by saying it's simply unrealistic, so ignore it, Newman and company dismissed it more determinedly by saying the idea of the cooperative, harmonious, peaceful, loving state in our species past is nothing more than which our limbic brain is the memory of, instinctive self has memory of, is nothing more than a nostalgia for the security of infancy. As Newman wrote, the dawn state of perfect contentment was never an historical state. It didn't actually exist. It's just nostalgia for the maternal womb. So, and I do mention this theory of that it's nothing more, that our soul is nothing more than this loving cooperative part of itself is nothing more nostalgia for the security of infancy in paragraph 184 of Freedom. So these other thinkers weren't even going to accept that humans did once live in a cooperative, loving, Edenic state, which our moral instinctive self is the memory of. Here's another one. In his 1975 book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, Jules Janes did recognise that there was a time when modern consciousness, these are quotes, did not exist and humans were purely intuitive, and that later the logical conscious brain usurped management from and killed the old pre-logical, radiantly innocent, God-run, intuitive, instinctive brain. So he's done pretty well. He's got pretty close to the truth there. But his explanation for why this happened was that the two hemispheres of our neocortex that actually represent these two states, the logical thinking left side of our brain, and our more intuitive and imaginative right side of our brain simply switched dominance. But again, that doesn't explain why there was this repression of our instinctive, intuitive, loving soul, why this psychotic state of the human condition emerged. I should mention that this explanation, the real explanation of why there is this left and right hemisphere switch dominance is explained in paragraph 682 of Freedom. Basically that one is logical and sequential, and if you get onto a logical train of thought, then if it's safe, not going to lead you into confrontation with the human condition, then you freely can pursue that. Whereas imaginative, freewheeling, lateral thinking can be very dangerous, because if you start going off on acute angles and bringing in lateral ideas, you're very prone to encounter the human condition. I mean, children notoriously have wonderful imaginations, and it dies off in adolescence, obviously, when they resign, and they're then deeply afraid of the human condition, so they lose that imaginative versatility, and they learn to just focus on narrow sort of one-track thinking because it's safe, and not go off on the side and encounter problems that are depressing and then confront you with the human condition. You can, as I said, you can read about that in paragraph 682 of Freedom. So again, the other thinkers who have recognised the elements of instinct and intellect as being involved in the human condition, but who have not got to the bottom of it all, you can read about that in Freedom Expanded, this book here. But I just thought that would just help flesh out a little bit for you, a bit more of the how fearful the issue of the human condition has been, because these are thinkers that actually got very close to it and then veered away most determinedly. So that's, as you read into Freedom, you'll see and get to appreciate more and more just how afraid we have been of the human condition and how it's affected all our behaviour. This dark corner that we don't want to go near, and we spend every moment of our lives making sure we avoid. And so we're on this mission of escapism, of self-distraction, and finding relief from that criticism, the implied criticism from our instinctive self, our limbic brain, through winning power, fame, fortune, and glory, and building bigger houses and so forth. And we're sort of this massive materialistic escape, and there's this adventure, and then there's this sort of romance, these few little positives we could get out of this once post-resigned life, where we'd given up looking at the truth about the dark side of ourselves, wouldn't go into that dark corner. You could see some people that sort of wandered, got close to that and then veered away. But the very interesting one for me is McLean's, what he learned from watching people with physical ailments in their brain, and how it let out all this soul was bursting out, all this amazing sensitivity and awareness of this integrative state. Just a marvelous evidence of the magic time we lived in this all-loving state prior to the emergence of the consciousness, and with it the upset state of the human condition. Now, I thought the next, we might next, so that's the bit of background I wanted to do about mechanistic science, and to give us a bit more of an insight. I mean, and that requires going back into the cave and dealing with all the dishonesty that's in there. And I'd much rather stay outside the cave. And as this understanding catches on, people will be really reluctant to have anything to do with that old life in the cave. As I said last webinar, they people playing those old power, fame, and fortune, glory, and not transcended from that and left that behind, haven't left that behind, will be caught like people wearing last year's fashions, and there's this people won't want to even go back if they left their hat in the caves. Well, they won't even want to go back and get their hat. They just want to go near there. And a great deal of freedom, you'll see, is just paragraph after paragraph of having to deal with all the dishonest excuses that we've come up with, that science has come up with, and demolish them one after the other. So it's an exhausting demolition of all those lies, because it's humans just notoriously, as Plato predicted, would much prefer their old dishonest excuses in the cave than the new truthful one, and will retreat back into that. So the only way I can try to is to systematically demolish all those arguments, which is what a lot of freedom is dedicated to doing. And I now want to introduce this person from Sweden who wants to talk about his journey with this information, and how resignation, the whole concept of resignation, helped him enormously in accessing the possibility of the transformed state. So it'll be about resignation and